Welcome to Everyday Cornerstone. This is a new series of podcasts that we've been working on, where we've been trying to answer some of the questions that came out of our time together looking at the book of Romans during Media Fast, and we've produced two of these already, where we've dealt with some big questions about God's sovereignty and salvation, the role of Israel today and historically, and lots of other things there as well you can tune into. And today we're going to be doing, I think this is our last one, and we're going to be doing some questions from Romans 13. I'm here with Ben.
Hello.
And Pete.
Hello.
And we're pastors at Cornerstone Church, and you can find on our website, cornerstonechurchkingston.org, lots of other resources, as ever. So, shall we start with a couple of the questions?
Yes. Here is a question from Romans chapter 13 that someone from our congregation asked following our media fast. They say, is it wrong to participate in protests? And they've given an example, a protest march or demonstration against our ruling authorities. So is it wrong to participate in a protest of any kind against our ruling authority if we're to submit? Another question was, what do we do when we're asked to participate in activities that would kind of contradict or conflict with God's commandments? And they've given the example, if we're asked to participate in support of same-sex marriage, as an example. So those are the main questions. There's also a question, if we have time to get to it, what does it mean that the hour has come for people to wake up? But those were our questions in regards to Romans 13.
Well, maybe just a minute or two on the context of Romans 13. So at the end of Romans 11, Paul has broken out into praise about God's wondrous gospel plan. And then in chapter 12, he said, in light of God's mercy, I appeal to you, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. And he's kind of exploring the difference that the gospel makes to our lives, and it's radical. It changes everything. And he's been talking about how that distinctive Christian life works itself out in the church. We are a body of believers. We've been given gifts, and so we're to be radical in terms of our love to one another in the church. But we're also to be radical in the way in which we love our enemies. So it's not just loving the church, it's loving outsiders, people who might persecute us, disagree with us. We can not just love those who are like us, but love our enemies because of the wonderful gospel that we've got. And in Romans 13, he's carrying on that argument. So he's showing what difference the gospel makes to our lives and how distinctive it makes us. And there he's talking about we can be distinctive in the world in our submission to God's authorities. So that's a bit of an introduction to it.
And very, very important, because we're talking about love really being the foundation for how we live our lives, as you've just said. And so as when it comes to governments, let's be careful. We're not just demanding our rights and stamping on other people's rights in order to make our life comfortable. So yeah, that's really important. Well, it says here in Romans 13, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong, for those who do wrong, they hold terror for those who do wrong. I mean, there's two sides we can talk about here, but the first side is you've got to take authorities seriously. We're not anarchists. And he's not calling for Christians to be rebellious against governments so that you've got this Christian organization that's almost a political group that is campaigning, always a pain in the neck for authorities, always trying to upset the boat, always demanding their own rights. That is not how we're to act in the world, and that's very important stuff to remember, isn't it? Because I think imagine if he called for rebellion against authorities, you've got a very different Christianity. We would then be taken up, I think, with political things and rebelling against authorities, rather than the main job is to love the world by preaching the gospel of love, the Lord Jesus Christ, to the world. And there would be then, this thing going on where, no, I'm doing God's work by smashing down some government.
Yeah. So we would tend to think of being radical as rebelling against authorities.
Yeah.
That's what a radical person is. But he's trying to say that a gospel radical is actually radical in terms of your submission to authorities and what God has established. And that's clearly what he's saying, that the way in which God governs is by setting up these authorities who rule on his behalf, really. And what they are to do is to govern a country and govern a people, and particularly to uphold what is true and good and just, and to punish what is evil and unjust. That's the job that they're given. And that will look slightly different in different countries because there's different systems that people have and whatever. But here, it's our government, isn't it? They make the rules, and we're to submit to them as agents of the Lord. So. When we break the laws of the land, we're not just sort of, sticking it to Boris or the Tories or whatever. We're actually resisting God's authority. We are resisting God's authority because those are people that he's established to govern the country. And, that's why Christians have always taken submission to the law seriously for that reason. And the other thing, we were talking about this before, is that... we are to submit to the authorities that are there, not just the ones that we would like to be there. So it's not that we have a political party that we feel aligned to and we submit to what they want to do. We submit to the ones that are actually in authority, the ones who actually have been given the charge over the land, not just the ones we would like to be there. So that's quite a radical call, because that means... we really take seriously, we want to take seriously things like tax returns, and we don't want to fiddle the numbers, even if we could and get away with it. We want to say, actually, no, because this is part of my relationship to the Lord. These are his authorities. So if I muck around here, I'm really resisting him, and I don't want to do that. So, that's part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're told that they've been established by God for our good, and he gives a qualification for what kind of rulers he has established. Rulers who hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. If we're not terrified of our government, which we aren't in this country, well, actually, maybe some people are. In fact,
we're terrified in the sense that your life is being threatened.
Yeah.
Not terrified that you don't like them and they're making decisions that you don't like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, then they are put there by God. And as you were saying, Tom, it's not what's more than, it's not that God has put a political party in power, but God has given us a structure of government. That is the authority. So you don't obey the Labour government because they're the Labour government. You obey them when they're in power because they're in power. It's the office of Prime Minister and the cabinet and the government. That is the authority God has instituted, and who fills that changes. But our allegiance is to the structure of authority rather than to a political party. And that's why if you're a Tory, you should obey the law when Labour's in, or whoever else, and vice versa.
Because, we've got to think of the alternatives of that. If it's all every man for himself, every woman for themselves, it's anarchy, and anarchy is not a good place to live ever. Yeah. There's no anywhere where there's been anarchy where it's been safe, prosperous, good to live. It's a bit like The Purge, isn't it? I mean, I've never seen those films, but there's a day, isn't there, in the films where there is no law. You can do anything you like. That is not a pleasant place, I guess, in those films to live in. No.
Yeah, that's right. And
so anarchy sounds good, doesn't it? I mean, I love the Sex Pistols song, Anarchy in the UK. I wanna be, anarchy. I mean, it was great. And, the sort of crying out against the governments. It feels very youthful, God save the Queen and the fascist regime. All of those sort of songs are like anthems, and they feel good. But to live in anarchy is to mean that I can drive on the road any speed I like, and I'm not going to obey a zebra crossing or any other red light. And if you're in my way, I'll run you down. And it doesn't matter. It's a disaster, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, and God isn't an anarchist.
No.
And he gives us rules and laws. He is a God of rules and laws because they are actually good to live by.
Yeah. I think that's right. And so this is partly, with all of these questions, and we will discuss like the exceptions in just a moment, or not exceptions, but the qualifications. But with all of this, we have to sort of be radical in seeing what it is saying and not just going straight to what it isn't saying. And so there's no use saying, oh yes, well he says this, but what about those who live under a dictator? If we're downloading all our music illegally and we're watching live sport illegally, well, before we think about what the dictator's doing wrong and how to, we should think about we should say, well, hold on, like, there's no use me protesting about these. I need to get my own heart in line here because I should deal with myself first, not just think of others. So this is a radical thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So pay your taxes. Someone's got to fill in the holes in the road. I know it seems like they don't, but someone's got to look after the roads. Someone's got to look after where the rubbish goes.
Okay, so that's something of what it is saying. I mean, these questions are kind of do address some of the limits to this, don't they? When do we disobey? Should we ever disobey? Can we be involved in activities which seem to be disagreeing? And when it comes to the protest question, of course, in this country, not everywhere. So in places like Belarus, you can't really protest. But in our country, there is a law that allows peaceful protest. So of course, because it's actually written within our laws that we can protest peacefully against things. And so that's not wrong if there's a particular policy or a direction the government are taking. We live in a democracy. We have a voice. We can join with other voices, and provided it's done in the right way, we can raise our objections publicly and try to get things on the government agenda. I mean, when the Belarus stuff was all taking off, a few of us from the church went up to central London in order to try to protest and get this on the government's agenda a bit more. And that's part of what we're allowed to do wonderfully in this country. There is space for a dissenting voice, and now but it's how you do that. I mean, so I think if you look at some of the Extinction Rebellion protests particularly, a line is crossed between peaceful protest and actual anarchy and vandalism. So when you're actually smashing up other people's property and businesses, or covering it in paint, or doing
being
these
very
kinds of things,
rude about leaders, saying horrible, ugly things, or they should die, or that sort of aggressive language. That's all wrong, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you've broken a law by destroying
and you've broken the law of love as well.
Yeah. So I think the protest one is one of the more straightforward ones. It's we are. This doesn't in any way say we can't have a vote, raise our voice.
Particularly if we might go on to this, what constitutes sort of an authority that God has put in power for our good, and what constitutes an imposter, or an authority that is ruling not in the way that God mandates rulers should rule. Don't know if you were going to segue into that, but you can see here, rulers hold no terror for those who do right. So that is the definition of a ruler that has been put in power for our good by God. So if you're terrified of doing right, you are under a non-biblical ruler, a ruler that Paul is not talking about here when he says submit to the authorities, because he qualifies what that is. It's someone who you're not terrified under when you do right. So take someone in Belarus, for example, who are terrified just for simply going to church,
walking the street,
or
just walking the street. Yeah,
they're terrified for doing right, and therefore, can you apply this passage? Submit to that authority? You can't, because the authority is not the authority that Paul's talking about.
It's going above its station, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Authorities are given a mandate, is the language that we were using before that we started recording. Authorities are given a mandate by God. God is the overall ruler, and under him he's established rulers with a mandate. They are to rule in a particular way. And if they don't, and they terrorize good people or people living rightly, they are no longer following God's mandate as an authority. So they're rebelling against him. And in those instances, we are not called to submit to their every sort of whim and instruction. There's a particular type of authority.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. But even then, we've got to be a little careful because of what Christ did before Pilate. So I think that's right. But there's always, you've just always got to be careful that we're not saying, okay, now we can go and rebel and smash up the Communist Party, or if I'm in Belarus, I can start lobbing stuff at Lukashenko. That sort of stuff. But Jesus is before Pilate, and Pilate says to him, don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus says, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. So there's sin going on here. Pilate is a weak leader at this point, because in one sense he should have said, this man is innocent, and he did say that, and therefore why would I whip him, and then why would I send him to his death? And yet Jesus still submitted. So we've got to keep weighing these things up, haven't we? We don't automatically say, evil government, let's go and rebel. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So these things are not easy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And we may draw lines slightly differently to other brothers and sisters depending on where they are. So largely, don't rebel. If you're being told not to preach the gospel, we do rebel, because that's very clear in the Bible. Where Peter and John, they denied the authorities and said, who should we obey, you or God? So that's very clear. But then on other issues, we've got to be careful. That's really all I'm saying.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think, when Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, he recognizes that there are certain things that belong to Caesar and are within his right to command, taxes, honor, a military service, for instance, all kinds of things, whatever they would have been. And that it's right. If he's commanding something that is within his mandate, you should do it and give it to him. But if Caesar starts commanding things that belong to God for himself, then we don't just have the right, but the duty to deny him that.
Yes.
So if Caesar is saying, there is only one Son of God and it's me, you are not to worship the Son of God, the Christ, then we don't just have the right, we have the duty not to give to Caesar because he's transgressed his realm. And this is the thing with these authorities, isn't it? That they're not absolute, they're delegated. God is the only absolute authority to whom all allegiance and honor is due. He delegates it for a time to particular people, and providing they command within his mandate, within their right mandate, taxes, road speed limit, whether you can download this or that illegally, we have a right to give respectfully what belongs to them. But if they, as your example, forbid us to preach the gospel or to stop worshipping Christ or, to give up moral, clear convictions.
Yeah, so things like, there's a people group that you're not to mix with, or you to, put in the ghetto, or, that sort of stuff. That's against God's mandate, isn't it? Or there's a legalized racism that comes in, like with the Nazi Party. No, that's what you're saying, Ben, is above their station.
It's interesting. In chapter 9, you see the example of Pharaoh, because someone might ask the question, well, why does God institute some good leaders and some bad leaders? Why do we have good authorities some places of the world and other places of the world have bad authorities? Has God made a mistake, or has someone snuck in without God looking? But in Romans chapter 9, we see in verse 17, for Scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So here is a illegitimate leader who is enslaving God's people, preventing them from becoming their own people, going out to worship God. And yet God raised that person up. So what, we have evil regimes in this world that persecute Christians and prevent people from living freely. God raised them up, but in order that his purposes might be accomplished. And it's interesting, Moses literally went to rebel against Pharaoh. Moses was sent to rebel against Pharaoh. Let my people go. No. And he went back. So God, though sometimes in order to accomplish his purposes, God raises up leaders who we are then to engage with or interact with in a certain way. Do you see what I'm trying to say? It's hard to explain.
Yeah, although Moses did do that in a legitimate way, didn't he?
In a legitimate way.
He actually went and said,
yes,
right, you're wrong,
yeah.
Pharaoh, you need to let my people go.
Yeah.
And Pharaoh said no, and he kept doing that.
Yeah.
And then God changed the circumstances.
Or the example of the midwives.
Yeah.
Yes. When a ruler like Pharaoh demands that children are handed up for slaughter, the midwives say, no thanks, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Are they breaking Romans 13? No, because Pharaoh is ruling outside his mandate. He's trying to take things that belong only to God. God has made them. They're made in the image of God. They deserve protection, as image bearers and honor. You can't just systematically slaughter them because you're trying to sort of do some population control.
Because there is a greater law then.
Yeah, there is.
So there's a greater law, which is the law of love.
Yeah.
Again, and to kill children isn't the law of love.
Yeah.
And that's helpful because someone might apply Romans 13 flatly and say, right, all authorities. So Moses was wrong to rebel against Pharaoh, is how some people might say.
Yeah.
They might say it's wrong for people to protest against a leader that's in charge flatly, but it's not a flat commandment, this, is it?
No.
There's contours to it, and it's within a context. And if we are to not submit to illegitimate authorities, we're to do it in a particular way, as we saw.
Yeah,
which is Romans 12.
And I think there will be, the trouble is there will be, we've talked about quite clear examples. So if we're forbidden to preach the gospel, but if you take what's happened during these whole lockdown measures, it's quite a good illustration in one sense, because some people would say, well, actually to forbid the in-person gathering of God's people is outside of a government's mandate. They don't have the right to do that because that's God's institution, that's his church. Now, some people, and we would be among them, would say, look, if we were being forbidden forever from ever gathering again, well, we're not going to do that. But for a limited time, for the sake of public health and along with the nation, we can, as churches have done in history, accept for a time a law like that and not see it as a total rebellion against God. Other Christians might take a different line on that. In one sense, that's all right, but how we treat each other really matters. So there were some disgraceful examples on Twitter, particularly, of how certain Christians were being tweeted and treated for taking a sort of government line on it, and they were being called satanic and instruments, and for goodness sake, it's so bad, isn't it? And it's the opposite of Romans 12, isn't it?
There's no law of love there, was there?
No. And so there will be slight differences in
conscience,
in
won't there?
conscience, and it's it's worth bearing that in mind, isn't it? I think with this,
very, very, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah,
can't remember where we are now.
No,
what other questions?
The other, perhaps the other thing to come back to is what you were touching on earlier, Ben. Is this idea that they are generally instituted by God to uphold what is right and to punish what is wrong, and so if you've got generally speaking, honest, law-abiding citizens who are terrified of their authorities because what is good is no longer upheld as good in the land, but seen to be something that's punished, then something has gone very wrong with that authority.
Yes.
And at that point, they've clearly gone outside what God intended them to do. And so again, we have not just the right, but the duty to not listen, to not do that, but to to uphold what God considers to be right and just and, and true. So if you take the racism example, if we're being told that, if a black person comes into your shop, you should charge them more or something, that means that a certain group of the population are terrified just doing what is right, just going shopping and trying to provide for their families. They're terrified that they might be not allowed into a shop or charged more because of the colour of their skin. That's a terrible, they've gone way outside. And so we have the duty to say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to charge them the same as everyone else, And so, that's an important thing, isn't it? To think about.
I mean, Christians in Afghanistan, that's a really amazing example to think about, isn't it? Because that's a regime that will kill you if you identify as Christian or if you set up a church. So what do? Do they submit to Sharia law? Do they denounce the Lord Jesus Christ and convert to Islam? You'd say absolutely not.
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking.
It's interesting because you were talking about God raising up governments. I mean, what's going on there then in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
And I guess we don't know everything, but I guess there is a demonstration of what it is to live under Sharia law and what it is to live under Islamic law, and it's horrific. Yeah. And it sort of really shows what that's like to the whole world. And maybe God in his kindness is saying, hey, look at this. This is really what it is to live under Islamic law. Women have no rights. Children, have no rights. There's just a bunch of these misogynistic men ruling in vile, bullyish ways. God in his kindness might be just saying, look at that.
Yeah.
And I guess
because although we have rules in this country that have gone back to Christianity, they're largely tolerant, and we are tolerant of other people, aren't we? We do believe that people that worship other gods, even though we believe they're false gods, should be allowed freedom for them to worship their false gods, unless there's baby sacrifice or something, evil within it. But there's a massive tolerance, isn't there, in what we think as Christians, and it's very different to Islamic laws.
Yeah, and I guess this, texts like this, they do have to be worked out within the context in which people find themselves. Not that we compromise on the core truths of it, but I just think in the pastoral application of it, so the reality is, I think if I was living as a Christian under the Taliban, I would be a lot more cowardly than I am here. Do you know what I mean?
Course,
I think I would, and I think there would be. I'd like to consider myself to be I'll never go against Christ, and any law that goes against Christ, I won't submit to it. But I mean, I always remember you've told the story a number of times about. Those people who lived under, those Christians who lived under Romania
in Romania,
and they were saying,
when
give
they
your
were
home group names or something.
Yeah, when the pastors, I went there to sort of talk to them about persecution and so forth, and asked them what happens when one of their members is taken, which they were, and a number of them, and they're being interrogated and even tortured. And they give the names of the other Christians and the addresses, and the pastor said, "Well, of course they would. They've been tortured. Why wouldn't they?" And they'd come back sort of broken and saying, "I'm really sorry and forgive me. I gave the names."
Dishonored Christ,
and the pastor would say, "Well, of course you did, because you were being tortured. Don't worry about that." And it's just a sort of lovely attitude, isn't it, of the reality of. When pain is, inflicted on you, you're not really in your right mind.
No, and living under evil authorities warps you, doesn't it, in lots of ways? And
okay, what other questions?
What do we think? Is that? Covered the Romans 13 questions?
Yeah, and also it's God's. God will repay, won't He? We don't have to. Be the arbiters of judgment in this world. So if in that example in Romania, if someone So you might think it's your responsibility as a Christian to bring that government down and to hold fast to the end.
Well, I think that's what I wanted to say. You don't get that here.
Yeah.
So even in our rebellion, we're not talking about the church as a group of God's people rebelling against the government. I don't think you find that. You are talking about a certain law. You're not allowed to preach. We will preach. Yeah. But it's not a church raising itself up in opposition to a government. I don't think. I don't think we're getting that.
Because it's not their mission to do that, isn't
that's
it?
not their mission, no.
I suppose because the mission is to preach the gospel, isn't it? And but I think if you so if you take the Belarus example, you're living under Lukashenko, and everybody knows, and the international community has recognised that the opposition lady, Svetlana, I don't know how to say her second name, but has won the election.
Yeah.
I think as a Christian, you could, you don't have to, but you could join a kind of revolutionary movement to try to get her, who is now the rightful authority, to be able to be the rightful authority. I don't think you have to, and I certainly don't think you should. It's not anarchy. You don't sort of bring that about at all costs and make it the mission of the church, but providing it's a peaceful revolution, because you want to bring into power one who would better reflect some of the things that we've been talking about. She won't be perfect. She's probably not a Christian, I don't think, but generally speaking, will uphold in a way that Lukashenko doesn't what is good and punish what is wrong. Yeah, so will more reflect what God intends for authority. So I think but the danger is when that becomes our mission, I think, or when it becomes violent, or
But then you're not leaving room for God's wrath. You're not leaving room for God's plan. You're not leaving room for God to be the one who sovereignly deals with them. You take it into your own hands to be the judge.
And we're living in a world where we can go to our government and say, can you put pressure on the Belarusian government or whatever? Can we not? Why are we having ties, financial ties? Why are we giving arms to things? We have a right. We're in a world where we have a right to say all kinds of things. Why is there tax haven for North Korean government in London, that sort of stuff? We've got a right to sort of ask these questions, and try to, and certainly be praying and caring and
writing to MPs,
and
do that,
trying to help our brothers and sisters in communist land, in difficult lands, and communist lands.
Wilberforce was a great example of this, wasn't he? William Wilberforce, because he's dedicated his life to the abolition of the slave trade and campaigning for that. And he won it, didn't he? But he won it through the system that was in place, which was to propose a bill and to get support for the bill and then introduce it as law. It's an amazing film about him. Was it called Amazing Grace?
Amazing Grace.
Yeah, it's a great film about him, and you see the struggle that he went through. That's a brilliant
model
example.
Of how to do it, yeah.
And Lord Shaftesbury, he went through loads of laws. To change, so women are not even now not allowed to go down a coal mine because they
It's
were
a bit
shoving...
sexist, isn't it?
Exactly. Well, that's the funny
That's
thing.
the wokeness.
The very funny thing is
that
one of the laws that he helped children laws, animal rights. He was an amazing bloke. And one of the laws was that children, a certain age, and women were not allowed to go down coal mines. It's just a horrific job. But it wasn't too long ago. It wasn't too long ago when women campaigned and said that was sexist and they should be allowed to go down.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would have to say, you go, love.
Yeah, go and have a look.
Anyway, that's a completely
And I mean, just to come back to what we said at the beginning, I think, as with all of these questions, like what's happened to people in the world who haven't heard the gospel, I think there's good for us to talk about it. But in the end, we ought to ask the question, well, I have heard the gospel. How am I responding to it? And it's the same with this, isn't it? We can talk importantly about different situations in the world and what Christians should and shouldn't do. But I think, if I'm sat there sort of telling other Christians what they should do in Belarus and also downloading music illegally and not getting my NOT. I mean, I should just be quiet really and say, well, how serious am I about this text then?
Right,
I'm acting like I'm serious about it, but
I
actually
mean,
I'm not.
Wasn't there one of the questions about the wake up stuff? Because that's the sort of thing that's going on there.
Yeah, what does it mean to wake up?
Where is that?
That's
passage?
in verse 11. Do this understanding the present time, the hour has already come upon you for you to wake up from your slumber.
Yeah, so I mean that's exactly what you're saying, I think, isn't it? That these are big, weighty truths. Don't slumber through them. Don't sort of, lie through them by ripping off things and not obeying the government in one area and then complaining at other Christians in these difficult lands. So wake up to these truths. Think about them.
Yeah,
we're in a real world. There's hard things here. But largely it's love that's pushing us here, the love of God, the love of Christ. And we're even able to love those who are persecuting us. That's a big thing.
Great. Okay, there we go. I think are we done?
I am.
Okay, well, there we go. That's the last of these podcasts that we're doing based on the questions that came from Romans. So I hope these have been helpful to you, and perhaps when you face these questions again in the future or you get asked them, you can revisit these podcasts, and cornerstonechurchkingston.org is the place to go. I think I mentioned last time as well that Pete preached a few years ago through the whole book of Romans, and no doubt obviously addressed this as part of that, so you can go back to that sermon, or I don't know how many you did in Romans 13, but you can go and listen to those as well, and stay tuned for future podcast series.